Hi everyone, my name is Natalie. Today I wanted to talk about books related to or centered around immigration stories. This video idea came to mind because Miriam from Another Book Thought had tagged me on Instagram for a thing called a book stack for a cause, and specifically immigration stories stack, which is a challenge basically where you are encouraged to share a stack of books related to immigration or immigrants, started by reading every book on Instagram. They will donate money for each stack that people put up towards National Immigration Law Center that do various resources and programs for immigrants into the US. Miriam from Another Book Thought is on Instagram, but she has recently joined BookTube as well. I will link her BookTube channel as well below. I highly suggest you go check her out. She does a lot of interesting reading, especially mental illness related, which is something I also wanted to talk more about in a future video. Anyway, so as I was trying to pick up or to gather books for this book stack, I was realizing that a lot of the books that I have read that centered around immigration stories, I don't actually have physical copies of. I've been borrowing a lot of them from the library or listening to audiobooks, etc. So a lot of the books that I wanted to talk about or to share, I couldn't really share in a book stack format, so instead I wanted to take this time to talk about a few books that I've read that somehow talk about this in this video, and then also do some books I would like to read in the book stack photo. So that was a really long introduction. Hopefully it makes sense. I wanted to start talking about a book that pretty much was the starting point for me. I might have read immigration stories in literature before this, but I think it was the first time that I'd heard the idea of representation in books and in literature, and seeing yourself in books and reading, but it wasn't something I really understood on a personal level until I read One Day We'll All Be Dead and None of This Will Matter by Sachi Cole. This is an essay collection, and she talks about being an Indian immigrant, or I think second generation immigrant. And so she talks about being sort of the classic identity clash about a Western culture with her heritage and with some of the expectations that you have on yourself as an immigrant or as a second generation immigrant to be successful, especially if your parents has had to give up a lot of things in order to move to this new place and to provide for you. There's this level of expectations and dreams and aspirations to live up to, and I think she talks about that beautifully in this book. But she also talks about various other things related to being brown. So she talks about body hair and about appearances and representation in media, and a lot of other things. But I think it was one of those feelings of as I said, seeing yourself in books that for me was kind of groundbreaking at the time that I read this a few years ago, because I hadn't actually been exposed to these kinds of stories very much until then, which is kind of a shame. And I think part of it might have been that I wasn't paying attention to it, but I think another part of it was probably because I had sort of an internalized, complicated relationship to my own heritage. So it's one of those things that I think I've been avoiding, and so reading this book was sort of the starting point for me to start to unravel what that meant for me, why I had taken a distance from a big part of my identity and my family history. So it was a very emotional reaction I had to this book, but I think it touches on a lot of different things, and it's a wonderful collection and also a wonderful audiobook, which is narrated by the author, so that's always a bonus. Another book that sort of fits into the same category in it's talking about immigration and identity and culture clashes and all of those things in an essay format is Brown Album by Purishista Khakpour, and this is an Iranian American author so even closer to home for me. In this book she talks a lot about Iranian American culture and the clashes between those two countries, especially because they have such complicated political relationships, and even more so after 9/11, and the way that it shapes the way that the US view on Iran, that shapes her growing up in the US. She talks about, again, media representation, a lot of it pretty negative, negative stereotypes and that kind of thing. One of the things that really stood out to me in this book is how she talks about not really fitting into the Iranian culture, not really fitting into the American culture, and in a school setting, being other, and so choosing to be alternative. So she was bleaching her hair and having sort of wearing goth sort of fashion, and being actively different because she had already been othered in her surroundings. So making a stand of that was something I really related to from my teenage years and in young adult years. So I think there was a lot of things in this that I felt really intelligently handled, as well as just being funny and relatable. It's a collection I highly recommend, and I feel like not enough people know about this book. Next up we have a book that is also probably well known, and it is In Order to Live by Yeonmi Park. This is about the author moving from or immigrating from North Korea through China into South Korea. So this book, I read this a few years ago, and this book really opened my eyes to North Korea. She talks a lot about, of course, North Korea's society and state, and the way that it's so heavily controlled, the way that the people in the country are forced to live through unbearable circumstances. A lot of it is related to poverty, and of course there's a lot of injustice in the country and the way that the resources are shared over the country's population. Aside from talking about North Korea itself, she talks about the actual journey from North Korea through China and into South Korea, as well as some of the challenges she faced when she got to South Korea. I think is one of those aspects of the stories that you don't necessarily think about, that when you've left a country like North Korea and finally made it out of that country into South Korea, that is obviously much more open and modern and transparent in its doings, it still wasn't easy to adjust from her own perspective, but also the opportunity she had in South Korea wasn't it wasn't like she was suddenly successful and settled into a prosperous life. There's a lot of things related to her experiences as a woman going through this immigration that I found hard to read, because it's there's a lot of human suffering in this book, but there's also the resilience aspect that is also, I think, a common theme in the immigration stories. The resilience that is demanded of you as an individual to go through, especially when you're leaving a country of not choice really, but of necessity. The next one I've recently talked about, and that is Turning: Lessons from Swimming Berlin's Lakes by Jessica J. Lee. So this isn't quite the same as the other books, in that the author herself grew up in Canada, but her father had left from Scotland to Canada, and her mother from Taiwan, and then later in life she moves to Berlin. In this book she talks about trying to find her own place, and I think it is again something that is related to being biracial and being a child of immigrants, and journeying and traveling herself in order to find the place that she feels at home, and it isn't necessarily a particular country, because her family history sort of is complicated. She's trying to figure out how she relates to Taiwan, to Scotland, to England, to Berlin, and to Canada, and it's a complicated weave of places that matters to her, but also a lot of this book is about her finding a place that she has chosen herself. So it's related to immigration, but it's also related to migration and to sort of a personal inner journey. The next one I have is The Magical Language of Others by E.G. Ko. This is a author who is from South Korea. It basically is the story of E.G. Ko, who as a child, her entire family moved to the US, but then when she was, I think, in her mid-teens, her parents decided to go back to South Korea because of a job opportunity that the father had gotten. And so she was left behind in the US with her older brother and was separated from her parents for several years. During that time, she got letters from her mother in Korean, and they are also part of the memoir where she talks about she talks about identity and making your own identity as an immigrant, and as connecting your identity with another country than your heritage. So the clashes between those two things, and often the way they contradict each other. She talks about the complicated relationship she has with her family and with her ancestors, as well as talking about language, and especially the language of your mother tongue, and the way that the letters is part of the story as well, because she's sort of confronting some of the relationship she has with her parents and her mother in particular, and beautifully examines especially the emotional experience of both the being left in the US and trying to continue to grow as an individual, and also confronting and examining her relationship with her parents, and the way also that the separation informed that relationship. The next one I have is They Call Us Enemy by George Takei, and it is a graphic memoir, so it's illustrated by Harmony Becker. And this is, as I said, it's a graphic memoir, and it's about George Takei's family, them immigrating from Japan to the US, and his experiences as a Japanese American, especially during the Second World War, and being moved to camps because of the during the Second World War, and the injustices related to that, especially the injustice in claiming a particular identity for yourself and having other people question that identity. The whole thing of go back to where you came from, or where are you really from, that those questions and that concept. It's a ridiculous idea in general, but especially so for second generation immigrants who have been born and raised in a country and probably see that country as their home, and to have that question or those comments directed at you. There's both the conflict of how you see yourself versus how other people see you, but also I think, for me at least, a sense of almost being let down by the country that you have considered your home, and how it doesn't accept you the way you are. So I think this book is a fantastic immigration story told in the illustrated form that allows for certain emotional experience to be very effectively conveyed, I think. The next one I wanted to talk about is I'm Telling the Truth But I'm Lying by Basi Ikpi. So I'm Telling the Truth But I'm Lying is the story of a Nigerian American author experiencing bipolar disorder. So this is again sort of an essay collection, but it's really an essay collection. It's really a memoir told in essay format. So Basi Ikpi grew up in Nigeria, and when she was a few years old, she moved to the US. And so this book talks about mental illness specifically, but also it talks somewhat about her Nigerian American experience. And I think one of the most important things that this book does is talking about the way that a particular country's view on mental illness shapes the way you think about it yourself, and internalizes those things, and might shape the way you seek or don't seek help for mental illness problems. And or for mental health in general. And so this book talks about her experiences with bipolar disorder, but also talks about the way that it is framed by being a Nigerian American and being Black in the US, and growing up in Nigeria. But she also has a complicated family relationship. She has a complicated relationship with herself. Another aspect of this that sort of relates to the immigration stories is the stories we tell, and the way that they are inherited from our parents and our ancestors, and the way that that shapes, again, our worldview. And I think it's an important aspect of how memories and the way that we make sense of the world is shaped by stories that we've heard through generations. Lastly, I wanted to mention a book I'm currently reading, and it is Brown Album, a memoir of race, family, and home by Nikesh Shukla. So he is an Indian immigrant or second generation, can't remember exactly, but he's talking about being Indian in the UK, and especially he talks about the way he is trying to teach his daughters how to view their identity in this country, in the UK, where they will be judged as being different. From what I can tell so far, he's exploring identity and culture clashes and heritage and all of those things, but with the particular focal point of parenting and of teaching his daughters and of what he wants to pass on. So as I mentioned in the previous book, the stories the parents tell to their children and the way that informs their worldview. This is the perspective of the parents and the kind of stories he wants to tell to them. The active thinking he does in order to figure out how to tell these stories and what stories to tell and what not to tell. How to prepare them for a world where they will be judged in a particular way. How to influence their view on themselves. So far, it's a fantastic book and has again made me think about how important these kinds of stories are, and in general, and also how important they are to me as an individual reader, as I'm trying to come to terms with my own heritage and how I've been thinking about it for through my life. Up to this point, and how I will continue to think in new directions in the next few decades of my life. So that was all of the books that I wanted to talk about for books related to immigration stories that I've read and that I would strongly recommend. I will link, as I said, Miriam, both her booktube channel and her Instagram below, as well as the organizers for the book stack for a cause of immigration stack. Immigration story stack in the description below, as well as all of the books and all of the reviews that I've written for these books. So I hope you have found something that you might be interested in checking out. If you have read any of these, I would love to know, as always, what you thought of them, or if you have any recommendations for immigration stories, I would love to hear about them in the comments below. I hope you're doing well and you're taking care of yourselves, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.